Hello, this is Miss Ferguson, and I'm asking you to watch this documentary, the first episode of Chicano, and it's called Quest for Homeland, and it is a PBS documentary, and it is 52 minutes long. I'm going to break it up into two parts, and I'm going to play it through here because not everyone will be able to access it otherwise. And I will be stopping and giving some commentary throughout the documentary here and there, especially when the documentary is about to talk about answers to questions that I've given you to answer about this video. Before I begin playing it, I want to remind you of our week 2 learning targets. The first learning target is to explain why Mexican Americans were involved in land reformation. And the second is to explain why a Chicano movement developed. You should be able to answer both of these learning targets by the end of this video, hopefully. And I'll talk a little about it too by the end of the second part. So this is part 1, and I'm going to start playing it, and I'll pause it as I give commentary. Here we go.
October 1966, a group of Mexican Americans gathered to remind the United States of a long-forgotten promise. Calling themselves the Alianza, the Alliance, they met and claimed this federal land as their own, guaranteed by a treaty signed between the United States and Mexico. They arrested 2 United States forest rangers for trespassing.
We're taking full responsibility. The town of San Joaquin, just a second, yes, I know your laws already. We've been citizens of the United States for 120 years and we know the law. We're taking this upon our shoulders in the name of the town of San Joaquin del Rio de Chama.
Ultimately, it was the leader of the Alianza who was arrested, Reies Tijerina. But he planned to use that trial to argue that, according to a treaty signed by the United States, the people of northern New Mexico legitimately owned the land. At one time, the land in New Mexico, along with California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Texas, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, belonged to Mexico. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. 2 years later, the war was over, and Mexico had lost half its territory. Overnight, 100,000 Mexicans became foreigners on soil that had belonged to their families for generations.
I'm pausing this because I want you to think about this for just a moment. Overnight, 100,000 Mexicans became foreigners on soil that had belonged to their families for generations. That's really powerful. And it will tell you that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was made at the end of the Mexican-American War, guaranteed the protection of liberty and land of these Mexican people who lived on the land that United States took over.
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised these new Americans free enjoyment of their liberty and property of every kind.
The land was sacred because your parents and grandparents were buried there. Some of your children were buried there. And you would be buried there. So the sweat, blood, and tears of generations have filtered into the land. So it is holy, it is sacred, sacrosanct.
So I'm pausing it again. I'm sorry, but I have a few things I want to say. The first thing is the subtitles that I have are really off sometimes and does not correctly express what people are saying. So it may not be helpful to read them, but for some of you it may be anyway. The film is just going to list several reasons why Mexicans lost their land despite the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, sorry. And I want you to listen to these reasons, please, because you'll have to answer this. This is first question you're answering.
But the original land grants had been given under Spanish and Mexican law, which U.S. courts often did not recognize. Over the years, Mexican Americans lost their land to speculators, lawyers, and cattle barons. Some property was taken by force.
And the heirs to those land grants have resented that ever since. The Tierra Maria land grant was an immense land grant given to a certain Martinez from Los Ojos, New Mexico. And I understand that the land grant was sold for $200, a team of horses, and I don't know how many pounds of flour or something like that. But only one of the heirs signed the deed. The other heirs didn't. So the land grant was taken illegally.
By 1960, millions of acres, including the Tierra Amarilla grant, had been taken from the original landowning families. Stepping into this long-simmering land dispute was Reies Lopez Tijerina. Born in Texas during the 1920s, he was the son of migrant workers. After a prophetic dream about injustice in New Mexico, Tijerina decided to learn treaty law. He was convinced that he could reclaim the Tierra Amarilla grant.
Although we are fighting for land, we are fighting for the survival and protection of our culture. To the extent that we feel that to rape the culture and the
Some who disagreed with Tijerina thought he was an opportunist, looking for personal power.
That's just the way we will fight.
What you're really saying, in effect, is that you own this land, you want everybody else to get off of it, or if they want to stay on it, to submit to your regulation.
No, to the regulations of the town councils, which are covered and protected by the Constitution of New Mexico, Article 2, Section 5, and by the Constitution of the United States, Article 12, Section 2, where it states that all the treaties made by the United States government are the supreme law of the land.
The people of northern New Mexico lived as tenants on land that once was theirs.
So this listed additional reasons for why Mexican Americans have been involved or became inspired to become involved in land reclamation. You should know that you should have heard that some of them lost their land to speculators, lawyers, some taken by force, and many of the heirs of the land ended up being tenants on their own land.
In 1965, the Forest Service revoked half the grazing permits for small farmers, pushing them to the point of desperation. There was need for someone who could express their frustrations. When Tijerina, a former fundamentalist preacher, came along, he sounded like the Messiah himself.
I'm going to pause this for a moment. Again, the captions are not saying Tijerina's name correctly, but Reies Lopez Tijerina, he was a very, very important figure in the fight for land, for reclaiming the land for the people in northern New Mexico. And he was very controversial, and you'll find out more why. But for some, he was for sure a hero and someone, a voice where people had been silenced on the issue before.
We are now waiting an answer from the State Department to claim what belongs to us.
He was speaking the magic words. The issue, the struggle, had been alive for all these generations. And here was a man on a white horse, a man with tremendous charisma, who plugged in to a deep felt passion, more than a feeling, a passion. And he turned the spirits on.
Tijerina's mission brought him face to face with northern New Mexico's district attorney, Alfonso Sanchez.
At that point is where he started saying that the object of his corporation was to take over properties that the Alianza claims belongs to them by force if necessary, blah, blah, blah. And I looked at him straight in the eye and I said, Reies, if you intend to do what you tell me that this corporation is going to do, it is illegal. And right now I'm telling you that if you do what you say you're going to do, I'm the one that's going to stop you.
Que la prisión trajo cambio y trajo
In the spring of 1967, Tijerina faced federal charges for his role in the occupation of Carson National Forest. Tensions in northern New Mexico were escalating. Forest Service fences were cut. Haystacks and barns were torched. The Alianza was blamed.
I think that the action of Tijerina is matched by an equally violent reaction. For instance, I've had several ranchers come into my office and swear that they're going to kill someone.
When Tijerina announced plans for a meeting to plot the Alianza's next move, Sanchez was convinced the group was preparing a showdown to reclaim the land. The district attorney decided to stop the meeting.
I explained, if you meet and your object is to plan how you're going to take over property that doesn't belong to you, the Alianza or Tijerina or anybody other than the rightful owners, then it is an unlawful assembly, and I will prosecute you and file criminal charges against each one of you if later on it turns out that that's what you're going to do.
So his excuses that we were communists and trying to take over the land, he confiscated files and blocked the roads and threatened the people. Anybody going to that convention would be arrested.
This was getting out of hand. What if Tijerina were just a little bit successful? There were land grants all over New Mexico. And I think it was a real economic threat.
Sanchez called for the arrest of Alianza leaders, but Tijerina got away. Those who were arrested would face charges at a hearing to be held the following Monday, June 5th, at Tierra Amarilla. It would be a day long remembered by New Mexicans.
We don't believe in violence, but we believe in Jesus Christ, who used a whip to drive out the false preachers out of the temple. And I think that's all we did in the courthouse of Tierra Amarilla. We just used a little whip.
Tijerina and a group of armed men stormed the courthouse. They were there, they said, to make a citizen's arrest of District Attorney Sanchez for violating their right to assembly. When gunfire began, Sheriff Benny Naranjo was inside the courthouse.
My jailer ran into the hallway and he says, "Get the hell out of here, Benny. Get out of here." And he jumped out the window. Then they shot him outside the window. And I went to the window and they started shooting at me, and then they started shooting at me through the door off the hallway, so I laid down on the floor. But I heard them, that they kept saying, "Reies said not to hurt nobody, that all we want is Alfonso Sanchez."
Sanchez was nowhere to be found.
Had I been there, I guess those 100 bullet holes I wouldn't be here.
A state patrolman and the jailer were shot and seriously wounded. Two others, a reporter and a deputy sheriff, were held captive all afternoon.
My understanding is that Reies had tried to kind of calm down what turned to be an assault, and he wasn't able to. Because what he did, he just offered a vision to some people who were ready to fight.
The governor's office called in the National Guard. Revolution, it seemed, had come to northern New Mexico.
It was like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa were alive again. And they had gone and had claimed their land again. It was like wildfire in the movement when we heard about it. We heard it like that.
Among land-grant people, there was kind of a victorious sense that finally, you know, our cause is out in the open, and finally, maybe we can galvanize the nation, such as the African-American movement has done.
Some Mexican Americans were alarmed by the violence that had taken place. But Tijerina's actions fired the imagination of movement activists and inspired a corrido, a traditional ballad commemorating the event. After 10 days on the run, Tijerina turned himself in. He now faced state criminal charges.
I'm pausing it for a moment to make sure that you understand that there was a real movement in the 1960s by Mexican Americans to reclaim the land of their ancestors. And a lot of those roots came from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and from the fact that before the Mexican-American War, that land was their land.
Out of this whole movement was emerging the feeling we had, this used to be Mexico, this used to be our land, but it was a growing sense of a people and a collective history of struggle against an invasion and occupation and takeover and everything like that. And I think that had a lot to do with it.
I'm going to pause it again because her comments are very significant. This movement to reclaim land began to represent something even more than physically reclaiming land. It starts to represent something symbolic, the desire to not be strangers in your own land, to belong, and to be able to feel connected to this country that you were part of, to feel like you were not treated like second-class citizens, like Mexican Americans had been again and again and again and again. And so this movement to reclaim land really galvanizes and inspires people Mexican Americans to be involved in a movement to claim this country as their own.
The struggle for land inspired urban Chicanos who believed the United States conquest of the Southwest had turned them into second-class citizens.
Certain things you knew, stores you shouldn't shop in, movie theaters you probably best not go to, and still the synonymous sense that the word Mexican went with the word dirty. I remember as a child people feeling that the best thing they could say to me was, well, you're a Spanish girl, aren't you? And I'd say, no, I'm Mexican.
I hated being Mexican. There was no respect, there was no status, there was no participation in the society. My father not speaking good English was an embarrassment when I would go to school as a child. Now these were things that I wasn't able to intellectualize. These were things that I felt. We were walking around with a tremendous burden of being Mexican in a country that didn't want us except as labor.
So this quest for a homeland was a quest for belonging and a quest for dignity.
This is something that I'll never forget. And I'll never forget it because this was the evening that I asked my wife to marry me.
Edward Roybal, one of the first Mexican Americans elected to Congress, experienced discrimination firsthand.
And the policeman lined us all up, about 14 couples, made us put our hands up over our heads, and they went through our pockets. Then they asked each one of us to show credentials. I gave them my wallet, and after they looked at it, this policeman started to take my cards out of my wallet and drop them to the sidewalk. And then after he did that, he said, now you pick them up. I remember getting on my knees and picking them up. This is something, of course, that a man that had just asked his best girl to marry him will not forget.
Our parents consciously chose not to share their experiences with us, their bitter, discriminatory experiences. They thought that it would embitter us, that it would create sort of a hatred within us that they wanted to prevent and protect us from.
Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult.
President Lyndon Johnson, a Texan elected with broad Mexican-American support in 1964, was already under pressure from the Mexican-American community. The courthouse raid dramatized the growing unrest among Mexican-Americans. The legacy of poverty and discrimination was abundantly clear. Half of all Mexican Americans had less than 8 years of education, and a third lived in poverty. Politically, they were underrepresented. In 1967, only 4 Mexican Americans served in Congress.
Spanish-speaking people, I think, need to get closer to their government and to get action from their government. And get action.
Johnson responded by creating a cabinet committee on Mexican-American affairs.
For help in solving their very special, unique problems. I named Vicente Jimenez to the chairmanship of the committee.
And that message came to me too, that, hey, you've got to do something. Because here's this young radical group out there, they've got something on their minds, and I happen to believe that they're right. Establishment, you got to do something.
And say to them, look, when you come to that particular area, you must remember that here is a...
We walked this path to get to where we want to go. Some of the others wanted to walk another path to get to where they wanted to go. But where we wanted to go was the same place. We wanted equality. We wanted first-class citizenship. We wanted to be respected. We wanted our children to have better schools. All that everybody else wants, you know.
With telling them that we discovered this country on this side.
But the cabinet committee was not
We're
enough.
telling them that our parents...
Already, new voices were demanding to be heard. In 1967, Corky Gonzales expressed the feelings and desires of young Chicanos in an epic poem, I Am Joaquin.
I want you to listen to this poem, I Am Joaquin. You're going to answer a question about it after.
I am Joaquin, lost in a world of confusion, caught up in the whirl of a gringo society. I am the masses of my people, and I refuse to be absorbed. I am Joaquin.
Joaquin is the life of all of our people. Joaquin is one of us and is all of us.
The odds are great, but my spirit is strong. My faith unbreakable. My blood is pure. I am Aztec Prince and Christian Christ. I shall endure. I will endure. And now the trumpet sounds. The music of the people stirs.
For Chicanos,
I'm pausing this because they're about to elaborate on what this poem meant to many Chicanos. It was super powerful. And this is one of the questions I ask you, so please listen to the answers.
I Am Joaquin was a spiritual and cultural revelation. It was the history they had never learned in school. It was a celebration of their Indian and Spanish ancestry, of their Mexican heroes and American lives.
It's the experience that was so moving, because it was such a strong poem, you know, and it called you to action, you know, and I identified greatly with it.
Corky gave soul and spirit, gave it the real spirit of what was Chicano nationalism, which was very positive. If there was an ideology out there, Corky was very much the driving force.
Once you teach a man who he is, and you give him pride in himself, you give him the spirit to stand up, there's no society he can't exist in.
Growing up in the barrios of Denver, Colorado, Corky Gonzales boxed his way out of poverty. At one time, he was the third-ranked world featherweight contender. Later, he went into business selling bonds and insurance. He also turned to Democratic Party politics. In 1960, he registered unprecedented numbers of Mexican Americans to vote for John F. Kennedy.
Corky's motive for becoming involved in the Democratic Party was to bring about the changes that he wanted to see within the Chicano, within the Mexican community at large.
As director of Denver's War on Poverty program, he encountered a patronage system that offered little more than token jobs to Mexican Americans. After a public feud with the Denver mayor, Gonzales broke with the Democratic Party in 1966 and began a civil rights organization called the Crusade for Justice. He envisioned a Chicano enterprise independent of government involvement.
As long as we're not antagonized, nor are the young people antagonized by people who don't show no respect for them.
We as an organization, we're a nationalist organization, which means we put our priority on our community. We felt if Mexicans didn't stick up for Mexicans, no one else was going to.
Our kids are just as smart as anybody else's kids, given the opportunities. And we wouldn't be fighting so hard if our parents before us would have done what we're doing for our children. And they say, well, this is the way it is, you have to accept it. We found out we don't have to accept it. And our kids are not going to. We're not going to settle for this for our kids. We're going to work with them and teach them our new way of life, which is our right.
Corky was a hell of an organizer, you know. I mean, this is a guy who was really making things happen in Denver. I mean, there was a full-fledged community organization that was very sophisticated for its time, operating out of Denver, Colorado. And it was all centered around this guy called Corky Gonzales, you know, who was one of us.
Corky Gonzales would soon gain national attention for Chicanos.
we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America, only about $53 for each person classified as poor.
Dr. Martin Luther King had made great strides obtaining civil rights for black people. Now, he wanted to address poverty with a multiracial coalition. King was planning a Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. during the spring of 1968. He hoped to unite Americans of all colors under one banner to join in a common fight against poverty. Dr. King invited Corky Gonzales and Reies Tijerina to be part of that coalition. Only a few weeks before the campaign took place, King was assassinated.
Where are we going? We're going to try to fulfill Dr. Martin Luther King's dream. And if we Mexican Americans march to Washington, it is to tell this country that poverty is not a Negro problem. Poverty is a Mexican American. Poverty is an American Indian. Poverty is a Puerto Rican. Poverty is an Appalachian problem.
There were several busloads of people from northern New Mexico villages and small towns that were going to go. Some people who had never been out of the state before. It was really something.
Seizing the opportunity, some Chicanos gave voice to the frustrations of their people.
Everybody seems to be taking advantage of us, you know. Our Mexican-American brothers and fathers are the ones that go fight in Vietnam, and then when they come back, they have no jobs, they have nothing here to come back to.
Reies Tijerina and Corky Gonzales were leaders for the Southwest contingent of the Poor People's Campaign.
Okay, I'm going to pause this right now. So there are Corky Gonzales and Reies Tijerina were both two very important leaders with very different visions. So please listen to what Reies Tijerina advocated for as a leader and what Corky Gonzales promoted as a leader. This is one of your questions, and the answer is right here.
The newspapers is speaking nothing but jobs, jobs, jobs. It doesn't mention land, it doesn't mention treaties.
Tijerina viewed the campaign as a means of bringing the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and his land struggle to Washington's attention.
I would like to state that the Mexican Americans from the Southwest have come here in support of the Poor People's Campaign, to be part of the Poor People's Campaign.
Gonzales saw a larger objective. He and his followers wanted to create alliances and draw national attention to Chicano issues. But the Poor People's Campaign revealed differences between the participating groups. Without Dr. King's leadership, the campaign was soon floundering. Chicanos became increasingly impatient with the campaign's lack of progress.
Our rights as Spanish Americans and the Indian rights and the poor people, poor whites, are not being represented rightfully.
I would like to say that there is no division in our ranks whatsoever.
Reverend Ralph Abernathy, director of the Poor People's Campaign, tried to resolve the conflict without success. Chicano leaders began setting their own agenda.
It's the Magna Carta versus the Supreme Court of the United States. It's the Indian people and 16,000...
At the Supreme Court, Tijerina called for the recognition of Indian rights.
So we are happy that we made history today.
Ladies and gentlemen of Resurrection City, for 9 years,
Mr. Attorney General,
under the... We have 3 more things and then I'll be with you.
At the Justice Department, Corky Gonzales grew impatient with administration rhetoric. Gonzales challenged Attorney General Ramsey Clark.
When you say there might be discrimination in housing, then that means that you are either naive or blind. I didn't hear you say anything about the juvenile court, kangaroo court, that subjects our children to controls by people who don't care any more about them than except to advise them to go into the U.S. Army or the Navy or Marines.
Corky Gonzales was emerging as the leading Chicano voice.
Personality-wise, Corky understood the workings of the politics. He was skilled in that. Reies was so single-minded around his issues that I think it was difficult for him to swim in that atmosphere. Reies was not an organizer. He was a leader. Corky was a person who could both organize and lead.
6 weeks after it began, the Poor People's Campaign came to an end. It fell victim to its own internal troubles and to a Johnson administration that had become preoccupied with the war in Vietnam to the detriment of domestic poverty issues. Still, many Chicanos viewed their participation as a success.
When issues of civil rights were discussed, you started seeing that the Mexican-American community was mentioned, if not included. And we felt that we did attain that one goal, that we gained national visibility for a group that previously had been considered an invisible minority.
Soon after returning to New Mexico, Reies Tijerina began a 2-year prison sentence for his role in the takeover of the Carson National Forest.
Because they're nothing but racists. Let's face it. You have to understand that they thought that we couldn't march.
In Denver, Corky Gonzales and other leaders announced it was time for Chicanos to meet independently and on their own terms.
We came here to build the new Chicano movement. That's what we came here for.
Okay, so there was one other answer, well, question that was answered a few moments ago in the video, and it was about the Poor People's Campaign. So it fell apart, the Poor People's Campaign, but even though it did fall apart, it was still considered a success in some ways by Chicanos. And in what ways was it successful? That was answered just a moment or two ago in the video. So at this point, I'm going to stop this video. This is part 1. There is a part 2 that I'm going to play in a moment of Chicano Quest for Homeland, in which we'll answer the other questions. Thank you for watching this, and let me stop my share, and I will see you soon.